The men clocked out later than usual that Friday, the kind of late shift that blurred the line between evening and night. In the fall of 1985, work days in rural eastern Kentucky didn't end when the sun went down. Logging crews pushed until the machines overheated, or the light finally disappeared behind the ridges. The 12 men assigned to the flatbed truck were used to it. Most of them had grown up in these hills. They knew the roads, the hollows, the shortcuts that never made it onto any map. The hollow where they gathered sat a few miles off the main road, tucked behind a bend that most outsiders would miss completely. Locals didn't call it dangerous, but they didn't call it safe either. It was just understood. You passed through during the day if you had business. At night, you stayed on the paved road. That unspoken rule had been around longer than anyone could remember. The flatbed truck was already there when the crew finished loading. It was old, loud, and instantly recognizable to anyone in the county. The paint was chipped down to bare metal in places, the wooden slats warped from years of weather. It wasn't the kind of vehicle someone would steal to disappear quietly. But it ran, and in that part of Kentucky, that was enough. The men split up the usual way. A few headed home in personal vehicles. The rest climbed into the flatbed, planning to ride together back toward town before splitting off near the highway. It was routine, the kind of routine that lowers your guard without you realizing it. Sometime after nightfall, the truck never made it back. No one noticed right away. That wasn't unusual either. Shifts ran late. Detours happened. Sometimes a truck broke down and didn't get reported until morning. In logging country, missing equipment was an inconvenience, not an emergency. When the sun came up the next day, wives started waking to empty driveways. Lunch pails still sat by doors. One woman assumed her husband had slept at a coworker's place after drinking too much. Another thought, maybe the men had been reassigned overnight. Phone calls started casually, then with more urgency. By mid-morning, it was clear that something wasn't right. None of the 12 men had come home. No one had called. No one had been seen. The sheriff's office received the first report just before noon. A deputy took down the information, noting the missing truck, the number of men, the last known location. It went into the log as a possible vehicle theft with associated missing persons. There was no alarm raised, no immediate search launched. The assumption was simple. Someone had taken the truck, and the men were likely stranded somewhere, waiting for help. In that county, stolen trucks turned up all the time. Teenagers took them for joyrides. Drifters borrowed them for scrap runs. Sometimes rival crews moved equipment to make a point. The flatbed wasn't locked. It didn't have tracking. It was just another piece of machinery in a place full of them. The deputy made a few calls. No accidents had been reported. No fires. No hospital admissions matching the men. It was quiet. Too quiet. But no one recognized that yet. Families gathered in kitchens and living rooms, replaying the last conversations they'd had. One man had promised to fix a fence that weekend. Another had planned to take his son fishing. Ordinary plans that now felt heavy, unfinished. As hours passed, worry settled into something sharper. These men didn't disappear together, not without a reason. By late afternoon, the sheriff authorized a cursory check of the hollow. 2 deputies drove out, taking the same dirt road the crew used every day. They found nothing. No broken glass, no skid marks, no sign of a struggle. The hollow was quiet, the way it always was. Dense trees closed in on both sides, swallowing sound. The deputies didn't go far. Dusk was approaching, and there was no indication they were looking at anything more than a missing vehicle. They marked it down as inconclusive and headed back. That decision, later scrutinized in reports and quiet conversations, would cost time no one could ever get back. Night fell again. 12 families waited. Some stayed up, staring out windows, listening for engines. Others drove the roads themselves, calling names into the dark, hoping for headlights to appear around a curve. Nothing did. The flatbed truck didn't show up at any scrapyard. No one tried to sell it. No one bragged about taking it. In a community where rumors moved faster than facts, silence stood out. By the second morning, fear had spread beyond the families. Co-workers showed up at the sheriff's office unannounced. These men didn't run. They didn't abandon trucks full of equipment. And they definitely didn't all disappear together without calling someone. The case was upgraded, but slowly. Paperwork moved at the pace of a small department with limited resources. A formal missing persons report was filed for each man. Their ages ranged from early 20s to late 50s. Some were fathers, some grandfathers. All were known quantities. This wasn't a group of drifters. This was a cross-section of the community itself. Search and rescue volunteers were contacted, but availability was limited. It was harvest season. People were busy. The sheriff requested assistance from neighboring counties, but the response was cautious. There was still no confirmed crime scene, no evidence of violence, just a missing truck and 12 men who hadn't come home. The hollow was searched again, more thoroughly this time. Deputies walked sections of the tree line. They checked ravines and creek beds. The terrain worked against them. The ground was uneven, covered in leaves, hiding tracks and impressions. Any signs from the night before had already been disturbed by animals, wind, and time. The absence of evidence began to take on its own weight. No blood. No shell casings. No dropped tools. It was as if the truck and the men had been lifted out of the hollow and erased. Behind closed doors, deputies talked through possibilities they didn't voice publicly. A fight gone wrong, an accident that sent the truck off an embankment, something worse. But without proof, those thoughts stayed unofficial. The sheriff reassured the public. He spoke of patience, of methodical investigation. He reminded reporters that rural cases took time. What he didn't say was that the clock was already working against them. Every hour that passed made survival less likely. Exposure, injury, dehydration. Yet the working assumption remained that the men were alive somewhere, waiting to be found. That belief softened the urgency, slowed the response, and allowed crucial early leads to fade. Late that afternoon, a call came in from a farmer several miles away. He thought he'd heard a truck late Friday night, moving fast. Then nothing. The road he described wasn't a direct route home. It led deeper into the hills. Deputies drove it, searching for signs of a crash. Again, they found nothing. As the second night approached, exhaustion set in. Families began to understand something the authorities had not yet fully accepted. Whatever had happened in that hollow was not an accident. And if it was intentional, then someone out there already knew more than anyone searching. The missing flatbed truck, once treated as a minor theft, now loomed larger than the men themselves. It was the last confirmed piece of the puzzle. And somewhere, whether abandoned, hidden, or destroyed, it held answers no one had yet uncovered. As darkness settled over the hills for the second time since the men vanished, the hollow remained silent. No engines, no voices, no sign that 12 men had ever stood there together. And for the first time, even the most optimistic deputies began to wonder if they were no longer searching for survivors at all, but for something far worse. Something the hollow had already decided not to give back. By the third morning, the tone of the search had changed. It was no longer cautious or procedural. It was urgent, uneasy, and quietly fearful. Overnight rain had softened the dirt roads leading into the hollow, and by daylight, tire impressions that hadn't been there before were visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Search teams followed them slowly, walking instead of driving, afraid of destroying what little evidence might still exist. The tracks led deeper than expected, winding away from the usual logging paths and into terrain that even locals rarely entered. The hollow narrowed as it went, the trees growing thicker, the ground uneven and broken by sudden drops that weren't obvious until you were standing on the edge of them. Sound behaved strangely there. Voices didn't carry. Radios crackled in and out. It was the kind of place where distance became deceptive, where someone could be close and still unseen. The first discovery came quietly. No one shouted. No one ran. A volunteer stopped walking, stared ahead longer than necessary, and raised a hand. 50 yards downslope, partially obscured by brush, lay the body of a man. He wasn't near the road. He wasn't near the truck. He was alone, positioned in a way that suggested he hadn't fallen so much as collapsed. Deputies secured the area and expanded the perimeter, expecting the rest to be nearby. They weren't. Within the next hour, more bodies were found, but not together. One was discovered behind a limestone outcrop, another near a shallow ravine, another farther uphill, as if he had been trying to climb out. The spacing immediately challenged early assumptions. This wasn't a single point of violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Whatever had happened had unfolded over distance and time. The men hadn't died where they started. Some showed signs of movement after injury. Drag marks, broken branches, disturbed leaves forming narrow paths through the undergrowth. One man's boot was found nearly 20 yards from his body, suggesting he had been running or forced to move before going down. The hollow, once thought of as quiet and empty, began to reveal itself as a place of pursuit. As the search widened, the scale of the scene became clear. Bodies appeared in clusters of 2 or 3, then singly again, spread across several hundred yards. It looked chaotic at first, but the longer investigators studied it, the more it suggested control. Someone had been directing where people went. Someone had been deciding who lived a little longer. There was no truck in sight. Ballistics technicians moved carefully through the area, marking cartridge cases as they found them. The calibers didn't match. At least 2 different firearms had been used, possibly more. Some shell casings were recovered, others missing entirely. No weapons were found anywhere in the hollow. That absence was as telling as the casings themselves. The wounds told a complicated story. Some men had been shot at close range, bullets entering the back of the head or upper spine. Others had defensive injuries, raised arms, grazing wounds. One man had been shot multiple times while moving, the angles suggesting he was fleeing downhill. Another had blunt force trauma consistent with being struck after he was already injured. When the medical examiner began preliminary assessments, the confusion deepened. Time of death varied. Some men had died quickly. Others had survived for hours. A few had injuries that, in another setting, might not have been fatal. In the hollow, with darkness falling and no way out, they had been. Execution-style wounds suggested intent and control. Defensive injuries suggested panic and resistance. Together, they painted a picture investigators struggled to reconcile. This was not a random attack, but it wasn't clean or efficient either. It was messy, prolonged, and personal. The geography of the hollow began to matter in ways no one had anticipated. Steep drops concealed by leaves made escape nearly impossible for anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. Limestone crevices swallowed sound and hid movement. From certain angles, a person could watch without being seen, hear without being heard. Visibility was limited to a few yards in places. Even during the day, it felt enclosed. At night, it would have been disorienting. That realization brought an unsettling clarity. Whoever had carried out the killings knew this place well. They understood how the hollow worked, where someone would run, where they would fall, where they would hide, and where hiding wouldn't help. The absence of witnesses began to make sense, but it also raised a darker question. How did multiple attackers enter and leave without being seen? The hollow had only a few access points, all of which should have left signs. Tire tracks, footprints, something. Yet beyond the initial impressions leading inward, there was nothing definitive leading out. As the bodies were recovered and transported, word spread fast. The community shifted from fear to shock. 12 men. Not missing. Not stranded. Dead. The largest crime scene anyone in the county could remember. Families gathered again, this time not to speculate, but to grieve. The waiting was over, replaced by a reality far worse than anyone had imagined. Autopsies over the following days confirmed what the scene had suggested. Multiple weapons, varied times of death, no evidence of alcohol or drugs that might explain reckless behavior. These men hadn't stumbled into danger. They had been met by it. Investigators tried to reconstruct the sequence. The prevailing theory emerged slowly. The truck likely entered the hollow and encountered someone or something unexpected. A confrontation followed. The men were separated, either by force or by panic. Some ran. Some were captured quickly. Others managed to hide or escape briefly, only to be found later. What no one could determine was why. There was no sign of theft. Wallets were still on bodies. Tools were untouched. The truck remained missing, but nothing else suggested robbery as a motive. This wasn't about money. That left fewer possibilities, and none of them were comforting. State police were notified. Outside agencies began to take interest. The scene was now officially classified as a mass homicide, but classification didn't bring clarity. It brought pressure. Pressure to explain how something like this could happen in a place where everyone knew each other and where secrets were assumed to be small. As investigators walked the hollow again and again, the silence felt heavier. This place had witnessed hours of violence, fear, and pursuit, yet now offered nothing willingly. Every answer had to be pulled from it, piece by piece, and even then, it resisted. The most troubling conclusion settled in quietly among the investigators. This wasn't an ambush by outsiders passing through. It wasn't random. It was organized, informed, and deliberate. And whoever had done it hadn't panicked afterward. They hadn't left weapons. They hadn't left a trail. They had vanished as completely as the truck itself. As the last body was removed and the hollow returned to stillness, one fact became impossible to ignore. Whatever truth lay behind the massacre wasn't going to reveal itself easily. It was protected by terrain, by silence, and by people who already understood something the rest of the county was only beginning to grasp. Someone knew exactly what had happened in that hollow, and so far, they were determined to make sure no one else ever did. By the time the funerals began, the town no longer felt like a single place. It fractured quietly, along lines no one talked about out loud. There was the grief, raw and visible, carried by families who filled church pews and cemetery rows. And then there was fear, less obvious, but just as heavy, settling into conversations that stopped when someone unfamiliar entered the room. Investigators noticed it immediately. Doors still opened, coffee was still offered, but answers came carefully. People spoke in generalities. They talked about the men, about how hard they worked, about how they never caused trouble. But when questions drifted toward the hollow, voices lowered. Eye contact broke. Statements ended abruptly. Everyone seemed to know the same unspoken rules. You didn't go into that hollow at night. You didn't linger there if you didn't have to. And you didn't ask questions about who controlled it. Those rules weren't written anywhere, but they were understood. Passed down through warnings, glances, and half-finished sentences. Investigators heard it again and again, always phrased differently, always leading to the same silence. Some people claimed ignorance. Others said they'd heard things but didn't know details. A few admitted, carefully, that the hollow had been off for years. Rumors began to surface, first whispered, then repeated just enough to gain shape. Stories of stolen goods moving through back roads at night, of trucks that weren't logged on any manifest, of illegal dumping sites hidden deep where no one would stumble across them. Some mentioned armed men seen watching from tree lines, not locals exactly, but not strangers either. Men who didn't drink in town. Men who didn't linger. None of it was solid enough to put on paper, but taken together, it suggested something organized, something protected. Then, 3 days after the bodies were found, the flatbed truck resurfaced. It was discovered miles away, in a different county, down an abandoned access road that hadn't been used in years. What was left of it was burned nearly beyond recognition. The fire had been hot and deliberate, not the result of an accident. The wooden slats were reduced to ash. The cab was warped and blackened. Investigators immediately noted what wasn't there. No usable fingerprints, no personal items, no tools. The truck had been stripped and cleaned before it was destroyed. That detail changed everything. This wasn't panic. This wasn't someone trying to cover up a mistake. It was methodical. Someone had taken time. Someone had thought about what evidence could lead back to them and removed it piece by piece. The case shifted in tone overnight. What had been treated as a horrifying but isolated massacre now carried the weight of something larger. Organized, intentional, protected. Investigators expanded their interviews, pressing harder, returning to homes they'd already visited. The response tightened. People became less cooperative, not more. Some refused to speak without lawyers. Others suddenly couldn't remember things they'd mentioned days earlier. A few stopped answering the door entirely. Fear had crossed a line. It was no longer about the dead. It was about the living. It was during this phase that a surviving witness emerged. He came forward quietly, through an intermediary, asking to speak off the record at first. He claimed to have seen the flatbed truck late that Friday night, moving slowly through a stretch of road that didn't lead anywhere useful. He described men walking near it, not dressed like loggers. Armed. Alert. According to him, something felt wrong enough that he turned around and left without stopping. Investigators listened carefully. His account matched parts of the emerging timeline. His description of the truck's condition suggested it hadn't yet been burned. His estimate of the time aligned with when the men would have entered the hollow. For the first time since the killings, it felt like a break. Then, 2 days later, he recanted. He contacted the sheriff's office and asked to withdraw his statement. When pressed, he cited confusion, poor lighting, stress. He said he couldn't be sure what he'd seen. When investigators asked why he'd changed his mind so suddenly, his answer was short and final. He was afraid for his family. No threats were reported. No notes. No calls. Nothing that could be documented. But the message was clear enough. Whatever force had silenced him hadn't needed to say anything directly. From that point on, cooperation declined sharply. Investigators began to feel it themselves. Patrol cars were followed more often than usual. Anonymous tips came in, vague and contradictory, sending them down dead ends. At the same time, truly useful information dried up. It was as if the town had collectively decided where the line was, and no one was willing to cross it. Behind closed doors, the language changed. Investigators stopped referring to suspects as individuals and started talking about groups, networks, routes, control. The massacre began to look less like an eruption of violence and more like enforcement, a message delivered with overwhelming force, yet no one would say who the message was for. Ballistics reports confirmed that at least some of the firearms used were not common hunting weapons. That suggested access, training, resources. Again, nothing that could be tied to a name. The hollow itself became a focal point of unspoken understanding. Locals knew its boundaries better than any map. They knew which roads to avoid, which turns not to take. Investigators, even with state support, couldn't replicate that knowledge. Every search felt incomplete, as if they were only seeing what they were allowed to see. Families noticed the change, too. They felt it when neighbors stopped stopping by, when conversations shifted away from the case, when condolences became shorter, less frequent. Grief began to isolate them, not unite them. Some families pushed harder, demanding answers, calling reporters, contacting state officials. Others pulled back, choosing silence over risk. The town watched both reactions closely. The sheriff's office officially acknowledged the possibility of organized criminal involvement. But without arrests or named suspects, it was a hollow admission. They asked for cooperation. They promised protection. The words landed without effect. Everyone knew protection only went so far. As weeks passed, the case slowed publicly, even as pressure mounted privately. The burned truck sat in an evidence yard, a blackened shell that offered no new clues. The hollow remained off-limits, cordoned but unchanged. The men who had died were buried, but the fear they left behind stayed very much alive. Investigators came to a troubling conclusion. The town wasn't refusing to talk because it didn't know anything. It was refusing because it knew too much. And whatever truth sat at the center of the massacre wasn't something that could be uncovered with warrants and search teams alone. It was guarded by silence, enforced by fear, and sustained by the understanding that some things, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. As the case moved from active investigation into something quieter and more constrained, one reality became unavoidable. The killings in the hollow were not the beginning of the story. They were the visible consequence of something that had been operating unseen for a long time. And until someone was willing to say what that something was, the truth would remain buried, not in the ground, but in the people who had learned to survive by not asking questions. The arrival of state police changed the rhythm of the investigation, but not its direction. Marked cars appeared on roads that had never seen them before. Men in pressed jackets and unfamiliar accents walked into the sheriff's office, carrying boxes of files and quiet confidence. Not long after, federal agents followed, officially present in an advisory role, unofficially there because 12 men dead in one place could no longer be explained as a local problem. They started where local investigators had left off. Timelines, maps, autopsy reports laid side by side with photographs of the hollow. Every doggone movement was reconstructed minute by minute, not to solve the crime all at once, but to understand how long it lasted. That question mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. The evidence suggested something deeply unsettling. Several of the men had not died immediately. Blood patterns showed movement far beyond initial injury sites. Footprints overlapped, crossed, doubled back. In some places, there were signs of hesitation, as if someone had stopped, changed direction, tried to decide where to go next. In others, the tracks showed urgency, long strides downhill, then sudden breaks where the ground dropped away. This wasn't a single burst of violence. It was a sustained event that unfolded over hours. Survival theories emerged quietly, then solidified. Some of the men likely escaped the initial confrontation. They ran into the trees, split up, used what knowledge they had of the land. But the hollow worked against them. The same features that concealed attackers also trapped victims. Narrow paths funneled movement. Steep drops forced choices. Darkness erased familiarity. Blood trails told the rest of the story. They weren't random. They converged. They ended abruptly in places that made no sense unless someone had been found there. Investigators began to consider the attackers themselves. The coordination suggested experience. Not military, necessarily, but practiced. People who knew how to move through terrain quietly. People who knew how to track. Footprint depth indicated controlled pacing rather than panic. Casings were scattered, but not carelessly. Whoever fired those weapons knew when to move and when to wait. The idea of outsiders briefly surfaced, but it didn't hold. Outsiders wouldn't have known the hollow that well. They wouldn't have navigated it without leaving more evidence, and they wouldn't have disappeared so cleanly afterward. Attention turned back to the region itself. Through overlapping interviews and quiet intelligence sharing, investigators identified a group of men who existed on the edges of legality. Locals referred to them as enforcers, though no one used that word officially. They were tied, loosely but consistently, to a theft ring that operated across county lines. Stolen vehicles, unregistered equipment, cargo that moved at night through back roads no one patrolled. The hollows were essential to that operation. They provided cover, storage, routes that avoided highways and scrutiny. The flatbed truck, recognizable and out of place, had likely crossed into something it wasn't meant to see. Names were compiled, histories examined, old charges resurfaced, patterns emerged. But when it came time to connect those patterns to the massacre, everything fell apart. Every suspect had an alibi. Neighbors swore they'd seen them at home. Family members confirmed timelines. Employers vouched for hours worked. None of it could be disproven without witnesses willing to say otherwise. And no one was willing. Investigators began to notice inconsistencies, statements that matched too perfectly, stories that sounded rehearsed, alibis that relied on the same small circle of people. But suspicion wasn't evidence, and evidence was exactly what they lacked. Witness intimidation became an open secret within the investigation. People changed their stories. Tips were retracted. One man agreed to speak, then left town abruptly. Another asked for protection, then decided against it. There were no recorded threats, no written warnings, just consequences that everyone understood without being told. Federal agents explored the possibility of surveillance, but the operation had already gone cold. Too much time had passed. Whatever routes had existed were no longer active, or had moved elsewhere. The theft ring, if it was still operating, had adapted. Families watched the process unfold from the outside, their grief slowly reshaped into something heavier. They attended meetings. They asked questions that had no answers. They learned the language of investigations without ever being given the truth. Insufficient evidence, ongoing review, no further comment. Months passed. Leads collapsed under scrutiny. Forensic reanalysis yielded nothing new. The burned truck remained silent. The hollow offered no additional clues. What had once been the largest active case in the county slowly lost momentum, not because it was solved, but because it resisted solution. Quietly, files were reorganized. Active became inactive. Investigative priorities shifted. No announcement was made. No closure offered. The case didn't end. It simply stopped moving. For the men suspected but never charged, life continued. They were seen in town, at gas stations, at hardware stores. No one confronted them. No one had proof. The understanding remained intact. Some things were known. Some things were never said. For the families, the absence of justice became its own kind of wound. There were no trials to attend, no verdicts to hear, no official story to accept or reject. Just the knowledge that the men who killed their loved ones had walked away, untouched by the system that was supposed to intervene. Investigators, too, carried the weight of it. Some admitted later that the case haunted them, not because of what they found, but because of what they couldn't use, the lines they couldn't cross, the witnesses they couldn't protect, the truth they could sense but never secure. The massacre in the hollow didn't fade from memory. It hardened into something else, a warning, a reference point, a moment when the limits of law enforcement became painfully clear. Years later, when people spoke about it at all, they spoke carefully. About bad luck, about being in the wrong place, about how dangerous the hills could be. The deeper explanation stayed buried, protected by time and silence. But even as the files gathered dust, the story wasn't finished. It had only gone quiet. And sometimes, silence isn't the end of an investigation. It's the space where evidence waits, unseen, for the moment when it finally refuses to stay hidden any longer. Time did what the investigation could not. It loosened grips, shifted loyalties, and allowed things once carefully hidden to resurface without warning. The break came quietly, without ceremony, years after the Hollow had slipped from headlines and into local memory as something better, left undisturbed. A land dispute brought surveyors onto a wooded parcel bordering the original search area, ground that had never been fully examined because it sat just outside the officially marked perimeter. The men weren't looking for evidence. They were measuring boundaries, driving stakes, arguing over lines drawn decades earlier. What they uncovered instead was soil that didn't match the surrounding ground. The disturbance was subtle, a shallow depression, uneven settling, the kind most people would have ignored. But one of the surveyors noticed fragments near the surface, not stones, not roots. Something metallic, corroded and broken, mixed with scraps of fabric that shouldn't have been there. Local authorities were notified, then state police, then, quietly, federal contacts, who still remembered the case number. Excavation revealed a shallow grave, not large enough for bodies, not deep enough to suggest haste alone. Inside were weapon fragments, shattered firearm components, bent from impact or deliberate destruction. Mixed among them were personal items that had never been recovered. A watch face, buttons from a work jacket, a broken belt buckle later identified by a family member who had never stopped looking. The location mattered. It wasn't random dumping. It sat along a route consistent with movement away from the Hollow, not toward it. Someone had stopped there intentionally, long enough to bury what they couldn't afford to keep. Forensic reanalysis began immediately, this time with tools unavailable in 1985. Ballistics experts reconstructed the fragments, matching markings to known manufacturing patterns. It was painstaking work, but the results were unmistakable. The fragments were consistent with firearms registered to 2 men who had been questioned early in the original investigation. Both men were dead. One had died in a logging accident years earlier, the other from a sudden illness. Neither had ever been charged. Both had been listed in internal notes as persons of interest, then quietly dropped when alibis held and witnesses disappeared. Now, their weapons were speaking in a way they never had. The findings reopened doors that had long been closed. Old evidence was pulled from storage. Interview tapes, some nearly forgotten, were digitized and reviewed with fresh eyes. Investigators listened again, this time without the pressure of an active manhunt, without the fear of retaliation hanging over every question. Patterns emerged that hadn't been obvious before, hesitations, phrases repeated across different interviews, statements that aligned too neatly. One suspect described his location with unnecessary precision, as if rehearsed. Another corrected an investigator's timeline without being prompted. Details dismissed in 1985 now stood out sharply. As the picture sharpened, one voice finally broke the silence. A retired deputy, long removed from the department and nearing the end of his life, agreed to speak. He hadn't been present at the Hollow, but he had been close enough to the decision-making that followed. He spoke slowly, carefully, aware that what he was saying couldn't lead to arrests, but might finally explain why there never were any. He admitted that pressure had come from above, not explicit orders, not written directives, but an understanding. The case was bigger than the county, bigger than anyone involved locally, Pursuing certain leads would bring consequences. Funding, elections, safety. He acknowledged fear, not just for himself, but for his family, for witnesses who had already begun to pull back. No one had told him to stop, but everyone had understood when it was time to slow down. That admission reframed years of frustration, the stalled warrants, the quiet reassignments, the sudden lack of manpower. The case hadn't failed because there was no truth. It had failed because the truth had been inconvenient. Attention turned again to the flatbed truck. Photographs taken after its recovery had always been treated as documentation, nothing more. Now, investigators examined them differently, not for damage, but for design. Under magnification, features once overlooked became obvious. Reinforced panels, hidden compartments beneath the bed, welds inconsistent with factory work. The truck hadn't just been transportation, it had been modified. Those modifications matched methods used by regional smuggling operations in the 80s. False bottoms, concealed storage large enough to move weapons, stolen goods, or both. The flatbed's age and condition had made it invisible, exactly the kind of vehicle that wouldn't attract attention moving through back roads at night. Suddenly, the massacre stopped looking chaotic. The 12 men hadn't been targets because of who they were. They had been targets because of what they accidentally took. The wrong truck, the wrong night, the wrong place. Investigators pieced together a grim sequence. The logging crew had entered the hollow, unaware that the truck they were using had been co-opted into something far more dangerous than hauling timber. When they encountered the operation, they became liabilities, witnesses who couldn't be allowed to leave. The prolonged nature of the killings made sense now. It hadn't been about rage, it had been about control, ensuring no one escaped, ensuring no one talked. The truck had been cleaned, stripped, and destroyed because it was the most dangerous piece of evidence of all. Not because it connected to the murders directly, but because it connected the murders to a network that extended far beyond the hollow. With this understanding, the silence of the town took on new meaning. People hadn't been protecting killers. They had been protecting themselves from an operation that had already demonstrated what it was capable of. Despite the revelations, the legal reality remained unchanged. The primary suspects were dead. The remaining connections were circumstantial. The statute of limitations on related crimes had expired. No prosecutor could build a case that would survive court. The truth had arrived too late to bring justice. Families were informed privately. Some felt relief. Others felt anger. Knowing why didn't ease the loss. It only sharpened it. Their loved ones hadn't died because of chance or misfortune. They had died because they crossed an invisible line no one had warned them about. The hollow, once thought to be the problem, faded into the background. It wasn't the place that had killed them. It was the system operating quietly around it. The case files were updated one final time. Not solved, not closed. Reclassified with language that acknowledged organized criminal involvement without naming names. It was as close to an official answer as the families would ever receive. Yet even with the evidence laid out, the story wasn't finished. Because knowing why 12 men died did not answer the final question that lingered over everything else. If the massacre had been about eliminating witnesses, then someone, somewhere, had survived long enough to remember exactly what happened. And memory, once it exists, has a way of resurfacing. Sometimes years later. Sometimes when no one expects it. Sometimes when there is nothing left to lose. The final reconstruction did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, reluctantly, pieced together from evidence that had survived longer than the people involved. When investigators stepped back and looked at everything together, the modified truck, the burial of weapons, the silence, the fear, it stopped looking like an explosion of violence and started looking like a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The flatbed truck was never supposed to be where it ended up that night. For years, it had moved unnoticed through the hills, blending into the background of logging roads and work sites. Its modifications weren't obvious unless you knew where to look. Reinforced panels, hidden compartments, space meant for things that were never listed on any manifest, stolen equipment, firearms, goods that needed to move quietly, without paperwork, without attention. The hollow wasn't just a shortcut, it was a corridor. The men assigned to the truck didn't know any of that. They weren't thieves. They weren't involved in the operation. They were just workers doing what they'd done countless times before. When they drove into the hollow that night, they crossed into an active transport route without realizing it. To the people watching, that distinction didn't matter. A truck appeared where it shouldn't have been. Men were seen where no one was supposed to be. In an operation built on secrecy, uncertainty was a threat, and threats were handled decisively. Investigators believed the initial confrontation wasn't meant to end the way it did. The men were likely stopped, questioned, maybe even held briefly. But panic shifted the balance. Someone ran. Someone resisted. Once that happened, the situation escalated beyond containment. What followed wasn't rage. It was procedure. The pursuit through the hollow wasn't chaotic. It was methodical. Those who ran were tracked. Those who hid were found. The terrain did the rest. The darkness, the drops, the places where sound vanished. Each factor worked in favor of people who knew the land and against men who had only passed through it during daylight. By the time the last shots were fired, the decision had already been made. No witnesses could be allowed to leave. Not one. The cleanup that followed confirmed it. Weapons destroyed and buried. The truck stripped, wiped, and burned far from the scene. Shell casings collected where possible. Routes altered. Alibis activated. Silence enforced. And it worked. By the time law enforcement realized what they were dealing with, the network had already folded in on itself. Operations shifted. People disappeared from the edges of town. Some died violently in unrelated incidents. Others simply aged out of relevance. Time did what investigation could not. When the truth finally surfaced years later, it had nowhere to go. The men whose weapons matched the fragments were dead. The ones suspected of organizing the route were gone or untraceable. The witnesses who might have spoken had spent decades convincing themselves that survival depended on forgetting. No charges were filed. There was no courtroom, no public reckoning. The justice system did not fail loudly. It arrived quietly, long after its presence could change anything. Families were left with facts instead of closure. They learned that their husbands, fathers, brothers hadn't died because of bad luck or senseless cruelty. They had died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and because someone else decided their lives were an acceptable cost. That knowledge didn't heal anything. It complicated grief. It introduced anger where there had once been confusion. Some families felt relief knowing the truth. Others felt betrayed by it. All of them were forced to accept that accountability was no longer possible. The hollow never changed. Years passed. Trees grew thicker. Paths narrowed. Leaves fell and returned, season after season. No markers were placed. No memorial signs went up. Locals still avoided it, not because of superstition, but because of memory. The kind that doesn't fade just because no one talks about it. New generations grew up, hearing fragments of the story. Warnings without explanations. A place you didn't go. A road you didn't take at night. The massacre became less of a story and more of a boundary. From the outside, the town looked the same. Quiet, rural, ordinary. But beneath that surface sat the understanding that something enormous had happened there, and that it had been absorbed rather than confronted. The case files now rest in archives, stamped and categorized, their conclusions written carefully to avoid naming what can't be proven in court. To anyone reading them without context, they describe a tragedy that ended without resolution. But to those who lived through it, resolution came in a different form. It came in knowing why. The mystery was never about who pulled the trigger. It was about how an entire system, criminal, social, and institutional, could align long enough to erase 12 lives and then move on. About how fear could be more effective than threats. About how silence could be enforced without a single word being spoken. In the end, the Kentucky Hollow Massacre was not unsolved. It was unresolved. The truth exists. It simply arrived too late to matter in the ways people needed it to. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. Not that 12 men were killed, but that the world around them adapted, protected itself, and continued forward as if it hadn't happened. The Hollow still waits in the hills, unchanged and unmarked, holding the memory of a night when ordinary men crossed an invisible line and paid for it with their lives. And for the families left behind, for the community that learned to look away, and for anyone who believes small towns don't hide big secrets, the massacre stands as a warning. Some crimes don't disappear because they're unsolvable. They disappear because too many people survive by pretending they never happened.